Okay, everybody, here we are. Thanks for coming back to our Winter Plant Talk series, or if you're a first-time visitor, welcome. Today's topic is planting around trees with NSA Sustainable Landscape Specialist Sarah Buckley. So we will get to Sarah's presentation in a minute, but first, just a couple of details. I'm Michelle DeRusha with Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, and we host this series of plant talk webinars every winter. We have just one left after today, so winter is coming to an end. Next Thursday, March 13th, we will have Bob Hendrickson, Brad Kindler, and Justin Everton talking about oaks, willows, and cherry trees and the important contributions they make to Nebraska's ecosystems as keystone species. So you can register for that last plant talk on our website. Toby is going to drop the link in the chat. It's plantnebraska.org/plant-talks. And you can find recordings of all of our previous plant talks from this winter on that webpage too. And just to let you know, Nebraska Statewide Arboretum is a nonprofit member organization. So if you're not already a member of NSA, you can find out more about our different membership levels and benefits at plantnebraska.org/join. And Toby is putting that link in the chat as well. Toby is our membership coordinator, by the way. And membership support all of our tree planting and garden making projects, and also help us present free webinars like these plant talks and other events throughout the year. So thank you for that support. Just a reminder to keep your microphone on mute for now. If you have questions for Sarah, you can either drop them in the chat, or after she's done speaking, you can feel free to turn on your mic and ask your question in person. And so with that, we'll let Sarah Buckley take it from here.
Okay, hello everyone. I will share my screen here real quick. And today we're going to talk about planting under trees. And I'm excited about this because I think this is where we get to take a tree planting and turn it into a landscape and turn it into a space instead of just a tree. And I will never be sad to see just a tree planted. I'm happy anytime you plant a tree, but when we can take the next step and turn that tree into a space, we can do really cool things. And I'm excited to see how many of you registered and showed up for this. I know there'll be more views on YouTube later, but I was not expecting this to be such an exciting topic, so I'm thrilled that so many of you are interested in this. So I'm going to take a little bit more of a theoretical approach than we sometimes do, less about specific plants and more just about how we combine sizes and shapes into space today. And I'll end with some plant suggestions, but I welcome your questions about specific spaces that you might have in the comments, and we can get to those at the end. So to start off, why do we plant trees in communities? And that might be in communities of multiple trees, communities with shrubs, or communities with a tree and plants underneath. Anytime we have a tree with other plants than turf grass doesn't count. So we do it for maintenance. When we combine trees, multiple trees and their shrubs and their plant friends into one big mulch bed, we get an easier, just a set space to maintain, whether that's mowing around that whole mulch bed instead of around individual tree rings, whether that's knowing that we don't have to try to maintain turf in this space. Whatever we're doing, it's just nice to know we've committed this space to being for trees and plants and not for turf. We're watering it differently too. We get healthier trees because we've created a little microclimate where they can grow together. We've gotten the ability to plant some understory species, things that can't take full blazing sun without, a shady partner. We get an aesthetic that looks just a little bit more cohesive, and we get the ability to create some outdoor rooms and experiences. So this picture is a dairy farm near where I live, and this is my son enjoying their chickens. But I took this picture because I just thought it was so cute. This is just a little rock wall along their driveway with a tree and an assortment of random plants. There's irises, there's peonies, there's just all sorts of things under here. But what it did was it separated, the driveway from the working area a little bit, and they had this little tiny path through there, and we picked up our CSA here last summer, and every time we went to pick up, he had to run down this little path to the chickens. It took that tree, which performed an important service shading their driveway in the front of their house, and turned it into an experience. So I thought it was a good example of how we're just elevating our tree planting a little bit when we add some companion plants. And this is one of my favorite pictures that just shows what happens when we can create kind of an outdoor room in a space. I'm sitting on our driveway watching some fireworks. The perspective makes this look a lot closer than it is, but this is a maple tree with sedges and hostas under it, and I'm going to talk about this specific project a little bit later. But this was a problem area for us for maintenance, and so we turned it into a plant community that could be maintained in a specific way. And then what it did was also create this outdoor room that we enjoy sitting in the summer as a cool space in our front yard. And we're just going to look at some different examples of projects, and then we're going to move into kind of the how. So here's just a few comparisons of a tree on its own on the right and a tree not on its own on the left. And one challenge I had making this PowerPoint was we concocted the idea for this talk in December, and now I get to prepare a PowerPoint of plants in February and March. So we've got winter pictures, but I also kind of like that because we can see a little bit more of the bones. If I had taken this same picture on the left in the summer, it would kind of just have been a wall of green. So we have a little bit of an opportunity to see what layers are happening here. And if I am good enough at this, I can get myself a little spotlight. Okay, so on the right, we have, a tree, a beautifully planted tree. This is a picture I think that Justin sent me. I needed a picture to demonstrate a good mulch bed. So this is a well-planted tree. It was probably put in a very good spot, and we're very happy that tree got planted. But if we just look at it compared to trees in a community, it looks a little lonely. Whereas on the left, we have some big old evergreens. Underneath, they're full of winter creeper. That's one of my understory plants I'm not a fan of. It's caused me a lot of problems in life, but it fills a space sometimes where nothing else wants to grow. And under these big old evergreens is probably one of those spaces. We have some little suckering shrubs, and then over here we have layers of different size understory trees with suckering shrubs underneath, and it creates this whole outdoor room. If you're familiar with East Campus, this is right outside our office door, and we like to sit at this picnic table in the summer sometimes for meetings because we have a little outdoor room created here. Okay. If I have a nice little pointer, I lose the ability to click through my slides. Okay. Another comparison, I talked about just healthy trees. On the left is a tree that was pretty stressed by drought this spring, and it's young, so it was probably set up to have a hard time in our hot, dry summer this year. But on its own, it struggled maybe more than it needed to. Had we been able to put this tree in a community with a larger mulch bed where it could share shelter with other trees, would it have got so windburned? I don't know. Here's an example on East Campus of a much older planting, but this is a 38th, and I think that's East Campus Loop, the four-way stop on the north side of campus. And we have big old trees. We have shrubs underneath. And what you can't see as well in this picture is some newly planted things that are blending in perfectly with the mulch. But we have layers together, sheltering each other, sharing the space, transpiring next to each other. This is actually a very nice corner to be on any day in the summer. And they haven't completely given up on turf grass under here. They've basically just let it grow. Where the grass wants to grow, they mow it. Where the grass has been shaded out, they let, kind of the needles and leaves fill this space in. So when we move into the technicalities of planting under trees, I've separated us into two categories. One is planting under older trees. When we've inherited an older tree, we've realized it's outgrown its mulch bed, we want more plants, whatever the case may be. When we're adding to a landscape around an older tree, and then I've separated out what happens when we're planting a landscape along with a younger tree or at the same time. So when we plant under older trees, there is a challenge of dealing with the established roots. And I've got a couple images here. On the left shows just, the image that we were given in school a lot of a tree turned upside down is its root system is not necessarily the most true depiction of a tree. We have a lot of roots in the upper foot. This is where the water is. On any decent rain, a tree knows that. So a lot of its roots are up there. And when we plant underneath of it, we want to be aware. It's not the end of the world when we cut through some smaller roots or occasionally if we have to move things around. But we don't want to go into this setting with an auger. We don't want to go in with a big spade and just start digging away. This also shows on the right that when we consider, originally when we mulch a tree, we mulch to the drip line. And as that tree matures, those roots are going to extend much beyond the drip line. And this is why we get the benefit from planting trees in community, because this is where we get the ability to have a mulch bed that's much larger than the drip line and doesn't look a little bit ridiculous. If we just took a big old mature oak in the middle of a park and mulched it to the drip line, it would look a little bit maybe out of scale, the drip line to the tree and the park around it. Where if we add a shrub layer underneath that starts to fit a little bit more in it, it looks like it has a purpose and a space. So as trees mature, we see the mulch beds either get very, very large, and that's a space that we've removed the plants from. So now Mother Nature is going to try to put her plants back in the form of weeds. And we run the risk of trying to control those weeds using herbicide right underneath of our trees that may be sensitive to that drift. Or we leave the mulch bed alone and it gets a little too small, or it goes away completely because we've turned our attention to mulching our younger trees, and we run the risk of our mowers getting too close. We also keep our mulch beds small, and then we wonder why the grass underneath that tree starts to struggle. So we start to overwater or over-fertilize. We repeatedly reseed it, trying to get that grass to grow in what is essentially the root zone of our tree and possibly under the shade of our tree. And now we're starting to have competing maintenance needs between our tree and our grass. And would this be a better situation to turn over to plants entirely? As we plant under older trees, I kind of mentioned planting around the roots with care. This is where we don't use our drills. We love our drill augers for planting, but this isn't the right setting. We use our trowels. If we're going to use a spade, there are places to plant larger plants under trees. I just poke around with a trowel a little bit before, or maybe I go lightly with my spade just to make sure I'm not about to eat into a big, important root. And we use smaller plants closer to the tree. I love NSA's 3-inch pots for this. You can sometimes I've even planted under a big old oak tree with its craggy roots, and you can, even shake some of the soil off of a 3-inch sedge and tuck it in between the roots and tuck it back in, and that'll work just fine. It really mimics what we see in the woods with sedges under trees. They grow happily, in the crags of the roots, but we can't go in there with a spade and plant a gallon, hosta right in between the roots of our tree. There is space, and I'll show later that project where I planted hostas under a maple tree. As you move away from the trunk, there's room to fit some gallons and quarts. I can't picture too many situations where I would plant much more than a single gallon underneath a tree within its root systems. And then watering. We have an older established tree. It's already competing pretty well for water, especially if we have a species like maple that's pretty good at sucking up any surface water that shows up. So it does take just a little bit more attention to establishing those plants. And this is where I really like a soaker hose or even a drip system if that's what you have, versus a sprinkler. Because we're trying to, you get to trying to water around the trunk of a tree. I just loop a soaker hose a few times around and make sure that I have the chance to get those plants water, even if it's raining. Because we have the shelter of the tree, we have the tree already taking up water. It's just a little bit different than establishing plants completely on their own with no competition. So here, my first example is in Gehring. I think, is this the Scottsbluff Plaza? Michelle, do you remember? Is this Scottsbluff? We don't remember. It's either Scottsbluff or...
It's
I
scary.
can't,
It's
I
scary.
can't tell.
Thank you, Hannah. I had it written down. I was looking at both plazas for these pictures. Um, when they did construction, they were able to create a barrier around this linden and save it during the construction, which was a real benefit to the project because when you start with a brand new landscape project, you start with brand new trees, and it takes some patience till you can get to the shade point. It was cool to see them be able to save this linden and have an entirely new landscape project with a mature tree in it. But it didn't stop them from planting underneath of it. We've got all sorts of things. I have no idea what these fiery things are. I think they were a bulb actually, but I know that there's campanula in here. I know there's alliums in here. There's some geraniums. There's some hydrangeas. And I don't have a current picture. These pictures are both from a couple years ago, but this landscape is looking very full. But they stayed away from being right up against the trunk. And sometimes that is just simply the most, it just is. You know, sometimes we tuck sedges all the way up to the trunk. Sometimes we just give it a little bit of space and we keep our plants to the edge. And that let them use, they were very intent on having a lot of flowering, bright colored species in here. And they kept them to the edges of this bed so that we could keep getting the sun while still creating a community with this tree. In Omaha, this is a project that NSA has been assisting with for a few years now. We've had some trials here. These are some planters that trees were put in, and it was a struggle for the business district here because you could have come in with some annuals every year, with some shady annuals, watered them heavily, kept them blooming. That's the idea that was designed here. That got expensive very quickly, and they tried to turn to perennials to fix their expense problem. But they struggled, and when they came to NSA, I said, well, let's see if we can get an air spade in here and see, just so we can get an image of what root system we're dealing with. There is not much soil left on top of the roots of these trees, and because these trees are already so stressed in the planters, it was important to me that we did not damage them or cut into too many of them in a way that we may have been able to in a healthier landscape. So we carefully picked some sedge species. We've got some lamium. There are a few hostas. These actually had been existing for a few years when I got there. And we had to plant very carefully here. We had to sometimes bare root these plants and tuck them into the roots of the tree and fill them back in with soil. But the struggle that they had was if they left this to mulch. This is a busy business improvement district, a thriving community, lots of people, and while they didn't get weeds because this was such a challenging place to grow as it was, we got a lot of, debris and trash and things being set here, and they didn't like the look of it just being mulch, which would have been a completely valid option, to just keep it mulch, but they really wanted plants in here and really wanted to get some green. We tried for flowers. I'm very interested to visit this spring and see what we've kept for flowers, but it's a good example of the challenge that we have when we have tree roots already in a space. But with a little bit of compost, they've been dedicated to watering these spaces. I am very interested to see if there's ever a time that they will be able to back off of the water. Usually we think establishment water for a year or two and then we can back off. I have concerns that in this space water could be kind of a permanent situation with how competitive the trees are going to be. This is a really similar setting in Scottsbluff, but we have a lot bigger planters, and these planters are open to the ground. So we're not looking at basically a pot situation. The planters are raised, but they're open to the soil below. And these trees are spaced a little bit. They're smaller. I think they're crab apples and some smaller things in here. And so these planters every edge of this planter is going to get sun throughout the day. And they planted these up with, prairie drop seed and yarrow and catnip, things that can handle just a little bit of a part shade situation. They did have some loss in the years after, and I think that size may have had something to do. The size that we're putting these plants in next to an established tree, I think, may have been a challenge that they ran into. But this is the watering setup that they put together, and this is what I wanted to show was that They've basically assumed that because we put these plants in a planter with a tree, that we may be watering them pretty permanently. And some of that's because they're in Scotts Bluff, some of that's because they're in a planter, some of that is because they just know that they put larger plants in with an existing tree that had established itself into the area. So this is a little bit more of a shady situation, and I find this comparison very fun. The picture on the left is the tree I showed you at the very beginning. This is us expanding this mulch bed around a tree. When we moved in, this brick was maybe 2 or 3 feet out from the tree. There was winter creeper overgrowing it, and very sad looking grass trying to grow around that project. And on the right is Kendall's tree with the same setup, hostas and sedges. And we visited his neighborhood during a tree tour a few years ago, and I was like, I just thought that was very interesting that we mirrored the same project with the same idea and had great success both times. This is full shade. I have a very bad tendency to forget to take midsummer pictures of this project. So in the middle you can kind of see the mature sedges with the hostas coming through at the base of the tree. And it just creates this room, this space, in the understory. It's very cool here. The hottest day you can stand under this tree with all of the different layers of plants and the shade from the maple. And it's one of the coolest spaces that you can kind of imagine on a hot summer day. Shifting to young trees, it gets a little bit easier. I left this picture of the watering system in here because I still wanted to show that watering our plants, kind of individually from our tree is so important. But when we plant trees and understory plants at the same time or within a couple of years, it can be a little bit easier in some ways. We don't have to worry about the root systems. Everything's going in together. We can dig our holes, we can plant whatever size of plants we are interested in. And the watering needs are similar for the first couple years. The only thing to not forget is sometimes in this situation we see people treat the tree just like one of the perennials, and perennials have a much shorter establishment period, and we don't really worry about watering them in the winter. So when we do plant trees together with shrubs and perennials, it's just important that we remember the tree is going to continue to have establishment needs for longer. The challenges are that we need to plan a transition. So when we first plant a tree with plants, I'm going to show you several pictures coming up where we've put full sun perennials under the tree. That's what we have to do when you plant, a 6 to 8 foot tree. It is not producing the same level of shade as a mature tree. This is a full sun garden. Over time, it's going to transition to a shady garden. And if we're not in there editing that space, we're going to see some problems. And then, as I said, over time the watering needs are going to change. The tree will take longer to establish than the plants, but we could also see as that tree establishes itself, it's going to provide more competition to the plants than they were experiencing to start with. So these two pictures are only trees. This is just a group of companion trees, but they're all planted. On the left, we have 2 planted at the exact same time, allowed to grow up together. On the right, we have 2 very old trees that are probably toward the end of their lifespan, and we've planted, I think 5. I think I counted 5 trees underneath, all around the same time. And they're going to grow up together. Those older trees are going to get removed. They're enjoying the shade of those older trees now while they're establishing, but in the end, they're going to be able to grow together. We're not going to have the challenge of an older tree competing with a younger tree. And then I hope, this is by Hardin Hall here on East Campus, I would hope to see them go back in the next year or 2 with a shrub layer as well and fill this in with some suckering shrubs or even a taller understory. This is in Valentine. 2 years ago, I think, they had an opportunity. The highway through town was going to be redone, and they took the opportunity to redo all of their city utilities that were under the road and redesign their curbs and their curb plantings. And so we have trees going in here alongside sun-loving perennials on the left and shrubs on the right. And the shrubs we expect to kind of persist through time and for the most part be okay with some of the shade. But on the left, we warned this project and we discussed at planting that this is going to exist in this way for a few years, and then over time you're going to have to come in as these trees mature and start to transition this to a little bit more shade and a little bit more shade. It's not going to happen overnight though. This is a decades-long experience where we can transition slowly from close to the tree, maybe out on the edges, stay sun for a really long time. But it was a great opportunity to plant in here all at the same time and have these trees will always grow up with plants around them. This is maybe a little bit more mature picture of a very similar project. This is in Scottsbluff though. Same thing, we planted the tree, laid the drip, the plants went in. We funded this project, but the city handled all of the design and implementation, and they've seen the same kind of struggle over the years. As this tree has started to mature around the tree, it started to transition to shade further out. I think this corner is still pretty full sun, but over time that's going to become shade too, and that transition will have to happen. But in the meantime, we aren't just waiting for this tree to grow up with a mulch bed under it. We get to enjoy the flowering perennials in the time we have. And this is kind of maybe two examples of what happens when we don't come in and edit. So we have a rain garden on the left, and we have, really this isn't bad on the right. It's just showing the north side of this planting, where if you look at it from the south side, we've got suckering shrubs underneath, we've got red buds peeking out, but on the north side of these evergreens, it would have been planted. The mulch was there. It's no longer there, but we have a much denser shade situation that hasn't been edited for. And on the left, back to this rain garden, you can see the plant, you can see this open spaces where things have been shaded out and lost. And I am not part of maintaining this. I don't have a chance to discuss with the person maintaining this, but I can imagine that it's a weed control problem. I imagine that it's hard to keep mulch on there when it functions as a rain garden. We probably have some erosion problems, and it's really just not an attractive looking space, where if we had edited this space to include more shade-loving things and things that were more adaptable over time, we could have had a much fuller experience. Now, before I move on, I just wanted to kind of say, we haven't talked specifically about any plants, and I'm going to look a little bit at how we combine those plants in space, and I'll throw out some ideas, but I'm sticking more to the shapes and sizes and the communities that we can create versus the specific plants. And in order to describe this, I had to draw some things because it's really the only way at this time of year. So please take my drawings as a communication of an idea and not as, high art. So when we look at the kind of the maple tree with the hostas and the sedges, just this tree with plants underneath. We don't have any sedges involved or shrubs involved. We're looking mostly at sedges, hostas. I like to use Jacob's ladder, wood mints, phloxes, and geraniums in this situation. And we're really looking at a base layer or a matrix of sedges with flowering plants coming up out of them. And that would be kind of what this looks like in real life, is a base layer of sedges with, our flowering or our foliage plants coming out the top. We have, an evergreen situation, or this could be just larger shade trees with an understory layer. So we've got red buds, maybe magnolias, buckeyes, anything you can think of that's just a little smaller and a little bit more tolerant of shade. And then I have a suckering shrub layer underneath. And the real example of this is between our offices in Keim Hall and the East Campus Union. We have some beautiful old evergreens. There's red buds peeking out of here, there's magnolias peeking out of here, and then there's just a smaller shrub layer underneath filling that space in. And then this is, maybe we go really big and we look for every single layer. We look for shade trees and we look for understory trees, and we have large shrubs and we have suckering shrubs. And in real life, this looks like just to the south of the greenhouses on East Campus. And this is what I meant when we take a walking path and we turn it into an experience. This is a shortcut to the parking lot that you can take between the greenhouses. And this could have just been some shade trees, but it's not. It's multiple sizes of trees combined with some taller, you could maybe say large shrubs or small trees. and small shrubs, and then they even have some ephemeral spring blooming plants in here and a few shade-loving perennials that exist throughout the year. And this is one of my favorite walks on campus. There's many examples of plantings like this on campus and in parks. Um, but this could have just been a few shade trees to shade the the path here. They could have even forgotten about it and just let this shortcut be. But instead, you want to walk down this path in every season to see what blooms next, to see what wildlife is hiding in here. You want to keep walking down the path to see what is around the other side of the shrubs that you can't see past. And it's an experience that you want to have instead of just a space that you are glad for some shade as you walk through. So what that looks like, I know that sometimes it's hard to take this 3D visual and say, well, what does that look like when I'm counting plants? What does that look like when I'm purchasing plants and when I'm laying them out on the ground? And so if we take, maybe a situation where we have 3 large shade trees and maybe they already existed, maybe we're planting them. Our next step would be to come in. I'm not going to say what these large trees are. They could be anything. But we want to come in with some understory species and maybe 2 really big ones, maybe some nice magnolias or some red buds, and kind of fill in the line. And then around it, we can use our larger shrubs, our viburnums, our dogwoods, maybe some lilacs if you want some flowers in the spring. And now we have a community. We didn't necessarily need them. We've created it pretty full if we're trying to screen or windbreak without them, but we've created a community now with another layer. And then underneath that, we can fill in further with some suckering shrubs, some coral berries, some snowberries, spireas, things like that. That now just bring this together, and maybe over time we won't even need to mulch in the center of this bed anymore. We have, a full space, and we are just mulching the edges to keep our mowing, lines clean, or and we can move these around too. I kind of threw layers together. There's no reason that you need all of these layers. You could have just, upper story trees and some suckering shrubs. You can kind of pick and choose. But this just kind of shows if you take that 3D view and you flatten it on paper, what does it look like from the top? So that is what I have. And I'm interested to see what questions you have and if we have any specific spaces to talk about.
Questions in the chat. Marcy in Battle Creek is asking about certain types of plants that would do particularly well under an evergreen or needle tree.
So when I look at evergreens, and I have not tried to establish plants under an evergreen that I manage, but I have seen many here on campus, and what seems to do well is those suckering type shrubs. But you've got some pretty deep shade usually if you've got old established evergreens, and so I would look to like your snowberries and your coral berries. That is maybe the one place that I see on campus that winter creeper's filling a need. But I'm always very hesitant with that plant because it can make itself a little too comfortable. Just look to your very deep shade and yeah. Oh, hot pokers. Thanks, Bob. In the plaza planting under the linden. And yes, Bob, underneath my maple room, my Buckley oak is doing wonderful. We just expanded its mulch bed and gave it a layer of sedges last year. It finally got a little big enough to provide some shade. So, yeah. I'm wondering, Justin is on here. I do not have a ton of experience establishing things under evergreens. If Justin and Bob want to chime in, my kind of preference with evergreens is if we've been able to leave them branched to the ground, I just like to enjoy that room as it is and let their needles fall and fill in. But if you have evergreens that have been limbed up, I know they need something.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah, right on. But if you have evergreens limbed up and sometimes naturally, in the Pine Ridge, we see mahonia and common juniper hanging out under evergreens, so worth a try.
Yeah, I agree. But It's so tough, that dry shade. It's the driest of shade, right? And so if anything's going to make it, it's going to be a tough sedge. And they even struggle under there. Believe it or not, a plant I read about, and I have never planted under evergreens, but I hear good things about, is the prairie alum root of all things. And I don't know how much sun it got, because sometimes they're limbed up enough to where they are seeing a little sun in the morning or a little sun in the afternoon. Um, yeah, you need something that can take it really, really dry shade, that's for sure.
I would be interested in the alum root. I put that um, kind of on that maple tree planting with the sedges and the hostas that I've been showing. That tree was covered in winter creeper, and winter creeper frustrates me because it just covers the ground so densely, and it will just recover anything you try to put around it. Um, but I did put some heuchera, some of that alum root, on the west side where the mulch bed wasn't as extended, and it gets just a little bit of sun, Bob, but the it has tolerated that dry, mostly shade situation really well.
It's a tough bird.
Yeah. Um, but it sounds like with the evergreens, the question is really, are they low branching, and can we let them just be the room that they wanted to create? Or if they've been limbed up and we have a little bit of sun, we have a chance, but the struggle is the dry setting underneath of there.
Yeah.
Diane, is it possible to remove lawn in favor of low-growing, drought-tolerant prairie grasses and plant trees in the same area? And I'm going to say a high level yes. The kind of technicalities that come into that is when you first plant those trees, of course you can. You have an almost full sun setting for several years. It is harder to keep, most prairie grasses going once you start to get more and more of that shade, but things like prairie dropsy can tolerate a decent amount of shade. Some little blue stems will even take up to part shade. I think they still prefer 5 to 6 hours of sun, but over time you are going to lose some of that. And it would be important to know, what do you want it to look like in 10 years? Because for the first 5 to 10 years, you're probably fine with some, prairie grasses and getting things to bloom and staying full. But as the shade thickens, some of those grasses will hang on, but you're going to get a lot of open areas between them. And maybe a good understory of sedges mixed in with those grasses would be helpful. We have a lot of species that are perfectly comfortable from almost full sun to full shade, and they can really ease that transition. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, it's possible. Just over time, be prepared for the space to change. Gentry, thank you for your comment. The Mayor Valentine talks about how the plantings there have kept the main streets from flooding during big rain events. And I didn't go too in detail about them, but that was a big goal with those planting spaces, and I'm glad to hear that it's been successful. I haven't gotten back to visit yet, but that was a huge goal with those spaces, was when it rains in Valentine, it rains. And that big open street, I can only imagine how full it can get.
Yeah, last time I was there, he was showing us the renovated, and he was so proud of it. So
good.
Well done.
I'm very, very glad to hear that. Okay, I'm gonna need Rama of my very mature ash is injected every other year now to prevent EAB. Is protecting the root system more critical because of its vulnerability? I have no idea. So if somebody else does know, please chime in. I have not worked extensively with the EAB prevention. I would hazard a guess that it's maybe a question of, are we protecting the root system or causing competition to a stressed tree? That may be a good question for our forest health specialist that we can pass you on to. So native plants for under trees. So I mentioned a few. I always go to sedges if you're looking for flowering plants. Wood aster is one of my favorite. There's blue wood aster. There's big leaf aster. I've used Jacob's ladder under trees. Some of our Our geraniums do really well, maybe more toward the edges. They want just a little bit of sun. Those are some of my favorites, but really anything that's listed as tolerating part shade should be doable until you get into the dense middle, and then you really do get limited to sedges and some wood asters and maybe some ephemerals. If we're looking specifically to natives, that's one of the places that we sometimes trend into the well-adapted plants to get some of our shadier species. Jeannie, with large established maples, how careful do you need to be with roots that have made their way into an area that's going to be hardscaped? That may depend on what exactly you're talking about and how far away from the tree you are. I know I did have a situation a couple years ago where we had to cut a reasonable sized root, but we were we were maybe 3 feet out of the drip line of the tree. And sometimes you have to do what you have to do in the larger landscape. Would I have cut that root right underneath the tree? Maybe not. But I don't know if you're interested in chiming in and giving us a little more specifics about how close we are or how invasive the hardscape is going to be. Are we talking about a patio, or are we digging down in the ground to install something? And how big do you draw the trees for adding the understory layer? That's actually a really good question, because when designers put trees in spaces, they don't draw them to full size. And there's a few reasons for that. One, it would just take over the whole drawing. Two, in a lot of urban spaces, the chances of our tree getting to its truly full mature height size is not great. I actually, when I'm thinking about these plant communities and I'm thinking about them from a shady situation, I do like to draw them. Just for my own good sake. I may not give it to a client that way, but I like to just put on paper the full mature size of the tree and think about how those canopies are going to interact with each other and what it's going to look like underneath. When I made that PowerPoint slide, I maybe did them at 3/4 of the, I assumed we're talking about, 60-foot trees, and I only made them about 3/4 of the size. But when I think about it for myself, I really like to put on paper and see what the mature sizes interacting will look like. And I still do usually squeeze them a little closer. If you think about the woods, the trees didn't space themselves 60 to 80 feet apart. But I like to know what I'm working with, and I'm a very visual person, so I like to see that. But it's not what's usually communicated in a formal design. That's usually a percentage of the full size. Paula, the soil under our sugar maple will not grow anything. Grass, ground covers, etc. Will these suckering bushes have any success? I'm going to say that I don't think I would jump straight to a bush if you're already having trouble establishing other things. If you think about the amount of water a small plant needs compared to a shrub, when you're talking about planting under a maple, I'm usually assuming that you have competition for water and shade. And so I would stick with very small things and maybe look at how you're establishing them and what help you could give them. When I planted under my maple and we started digging, that soil was dusty. And I don't know, it's hard to know how the land was maintained before we had it, but you could just pick it up and let it blow off your hand. So we came in with a good amount of compost, and at the same time tried not to bury the roots of the tree. So it was kind of a fine line between spreading compost to get some organic matter back in. We made very sure that when we planted, we mulched probably 3 inches thick. We were trying to keep any drop of moisture that fell in that soil. And then we planted things like, we planted some pretty tough hostas, but even though we think of hostas as very tough, we watered those hostas for close to 2.5 years. Just knowing that they needed time to get their roots down in between the maple roots, and then it was going to take time for those soil amendments to actually improve the water holding capacity, and we made sure to keep it mulched. So it is a challenge to establish plants under a mature tree, and sometimes it just takes a lot more effort on the establishment front than we were prepared to give. But then also look at the soil and maybe more importantly, feel the soil and see if that's part of your problem. And I would not expect, if you're struggling with that, that I would try to, not sure if you mean by grass planted grasses or turf grass, but that's, I'm not a turf grass expert, but when turf doesn't want to grow, I'm usually out. If the turf doesn't want to grow, I'm not going to keep it there. And that's not a situation that I would personally try very hard to establish turf grass in. Do sedges do well under and around pine? Bob says yes, and we believe Bob when he talks about sedges. I have not. I did take some sedges out to a project in Sydney where they have a really beautiful community garden and a lot of big old pines, and we experimented a little bit, tucking some of like our oak sedge and our really, really, really dry shade tolerant sedges underneath. That was only a little over a year ago, so I haven't been back to visit yet, but we left them very committed to keeping those watered. So even
Sure.
those sedges, yeah.
I'll go ahead and type in some names
Thank
for
you.
those folks
Yeah.
too. And I know you're getting a ton of questions. It's like, there's no way you're going to have time. If you want, I could go ahead and chime in on some of those too as your
Go for
chat.
it. Yes.
Okay.
Maybe Bob, if you just want to drop in the chat, just a list of maybe like our 5 top dry sage sedges. I see a lot of repeated questions for those. Wild strawberry under blue spruce. Thanks, Jeanette. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah. And so a lot of folks are asking what native can I plant under the tree, and maybe I'll just rattle off some native plants. But Michelle, don't we have something folks can go to our website and download native sedges for woodland and no, nothing like that?
We have a handout specifically about sedges. Let me go look, and if I can find it, I'll put the
I think that handout, Michelle, has both wetland and woodland species,
Okay,
so
let me
it
look
should
for
have
it.
that. And then another handout should be available for just woodland wildflowers.
All right, let me go poke around.
Poke.
Yeah. So Sarah asks about adding soil over the roots of an established tree, and we know we don't want to add it up against the trunk, but can we add it out over the root systems, and if so, how deep? I don't think that there is like, an official professional answer on this. I have always tried not to add too much, and yet at the same time, sometimes you need some to get things established. Adding organic matter in the form of compost is not the same as adding topsoil. Organic matter is going to finish decomposing, and that's why if you ever try to fill in a space with compost, you'll come back in 2 years and it will not be where you put it. So when we talk about adding soil amendments around existing trees, compost is pretty safe. We don't want to add 6 inches of it, but we're pretty safe to add a few inches to help us get new plants established. But also remember that we can't plant that plant in a pile of compost. So we're still, finding a little pocket in between roots and wiggling that plant down in. Sometimes that means losing some soil and tucking some compost and some topsoil down in there. And that is maybe the biggest difference between piling soil on an existing root system and amending with some compost, is the fact that compost is still decomposing and we're not permanently stacking soil on top. Bob and Justin can chime in if they think I'm wrong, but I would be hesitant to add more than an inch or 2 of permanent soil on top of a root system, knowing that you're also going to add mulch on top of that.
Hey man, I remember seeing a silver maple that had 4 inches, or it was more like 6 inches added on top. It took a long time for that tree to die, but it did. And kind of what the mantra was, no more than 4 inches, but I think that's too much. I think just deep enough to get your plug in, right, is a good thing to use. I'm going to add just enough soil, so I'm planting into new soil, putting my plugs in so they have a better chance of establishing, because the roots of the tree will occupy that new soil. In 1 or 2 years, it'll be filled back in with new roots.
Mm-hmm. And to not maybe do it uniformly, do it in, add, we can have some variation to that ground around the roots. They're already not flat. So find our pockets where we can put a little soil in a plant and not necessarily add just 4 inches straight across the entire root system. I'm sorting through questions, guys. You've got a lot coming in, so I'm trying to leave some. I know Bob's going to drop answers to a lot of them in the comments, and we'll pick the more discussable questions. So this is a good question, and I'm going to lean a little bit on Bob and Justin for this because it's a little bit out of my experience. But when we take 2 older trees, we know that they're going away. We have maybe 5 years left, and we're going to underplant them. Kind of like I showed in that planting by Hardin Hall. In this particular situation, it's pin oaks, but it could be anything. It could be your ash trees. What plants can we put under there, knowing that we have existing tree root systems? Reading for a few more details. Do we suggest understory trees until they go? And I know that I've heard different recommendations among us here at the Forest Service that we plant an understory. Oh no, plant your future shade trees so they get a head start. Can those future shade trees establish themselves under 2 old pin oaks? What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I would say probably not. The problem with planting under trees, this is why they say you're probably not planting under the tree, but you're planting in the shadows. So if you can get to that edge, I've done this where we anticipated big green ash going out years ago, and then they didn't, and the trees we underplanted them with are all leaning to reach for the sky. And you can put up with that. That's not a problem, but just beware the trees probably won't do exactly like you want them to. So I'd say, but that doesn't mean you can't underplant with shade tolerant understory trees like ironwood or redbud, and then shade tolerant. I've been so impressed with things like sedges, zizia, other things that can transition from a shade environment to sun when the big trees go out.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I agree with that because I've seen, the best of intentions and then the tree's still alive 10 years later and you got this leaning tower of Pisa going, And then the crew comes in to remove the tree and you tell them, don't break my tree. I've been growing that thing under this tree for 12 years and the crew's going to kind of probably add to your bid because of that, because they have to avoid that tree now, and not destroy it when they're taking down the big dead one.
That's a really good point. One question I would add as I finished reading her question. These pin oaks have, maybe we're estimating 5 years left. They've suffered from chlorosis, hail, some oak parasite, all sorts of things. I guess my question would be, if we think they're so declining, let's take one out, get our shade tree started there, while we get a benefit from whatever the other tree has left in its life. It might be more of a phasing removal than just waiting to see how long they decline. That's just an option. I don't know your whole situation. That would be what I would be tempted to do, though, is pick whichever one looks worse, get it out of there, so that I can get another shade tree started, so that at least I don't lose both at the same time. Okay, I'm going to skip some questions a little bit. I think we're slowly answering some of these at the same time, but mature elms with some of the roots coming up and it's hard to mow around it. What at this point, what could I plant to help these trees? I would think anything we've talked about, just take a look at the spaces you have between those roots, but I would be tempted to take the whole space that those roots are occupying and turn it into a community of some kind. And with that sort of space, you should have room to sneak a few shrubs in if you like, or maybe some understory trees. Gentry, fruit trees in the backyard, hearing about creating a guild to attract beneficial insects and repel pests, potentially even change the flavor of the apples. But this is all from blogs and not necessarily trusted sources. I think my first thought is that some of it doesn't matter if it's fully true, right? We know that having a plant community is beneficial, whether we actually manage to change the flavor of the apple or not. We know that a diverse ecosystem is way more likely to have beneficial insects in it, whether we've planted the exact species that the blog said or not. We're still creating a diverse and healthy ecosystem. If you're looking for maybe really trusted sources on like the alternative plants, like plant roses to attract the Japanese beetles away from your XYZ, I would go to Extension on those questions. I think they do a lot more of the research on that. But it doesn't sound like, whether or not you achieve everything this blog is promising, that creating the community would ever be a bad thing. It's kind of my feeling. We don't always get to know if the answer is perfect before we start, but we can make sure we're not doing something detrimental, and nothing you said sounds like it has any potential detriment to it. And all of those herbs, whether they change the flavor of the apples or not, will be very attractive to pollinators, which are only going to benefit your apples. So Justin, while I skim for questions, is there anything you would add about planting? There's a lot of questions about how much can we plant around mature trees, knowing we'll disturb the root systems a little bit. How far can we push that?
Yeah, I personally feel like as long as you're not running a rototiller through there, you can get away with a lot. So the be aware that some species are just more shallow rooted. So like a silver maple or a red maple, it's going to be hard to plant under there because the roots are all at the surface. But around oaks with coarse root systems, wow, and hackberry, you're not going to kill a hackberry worrying about bumping into its roots. So maybe think about it that way a little bit. I threw out a few suggestions. I know it's a dirty word sometimes, non-native plants, but I can never get enough of things like sedum and purple coneflower. And one thing I really like in the shade in our parks is Korean reed grass. So there are solutions for well-behaved non-natives too.
I think there's maybe 2 more questions we'll try to hit because we're almost at 1 o'clock. But Pam, I know that you're just prompting me with this question. When you design, do you take pollinator friendly and various bloom seasons into account always? That's never not on my mind when I'm selecting plants. Do I have spring, summer, fall blooming things? Do I have, some different varieties of flowers? It would be hard to say that we ever design without that on our mind. But it's a good thing to remind people that we think about when we think about blooming plants. It's not just spring. Right now, we're really ready for spring blooming plants. And so you always can tell when somebody planted a new landscape that in the spring, because they were hungry for all of those first blooms. And then, mid-July, beginning of August, there's nothing blooming because we were too excited for May. So we're always thinking about the full season. And if we do that, if we are already thinking about diversity and bloom time, we have in effect thought about the pollinators. We've effectively thought about the birds. We don't necessarily need to check it off a list because it's going to happen. Julie, if turf won't grow under a maple, what are options to cover the dirt? Mulch. You have a lot of different choices: wood chips, pine straw, plants. We can have living mulch. But I do agree that we want to cover the dirt. We don't want it open, that we will get, kind of erosion, that it's exposing our roots and things. Bertha, no, we didn't talk specifically about the site that wind matters, north and south. And I have a question that isn't fully thought out, maybe, about what about a container around the tree? I never would purposely create a container around a tree. All of the situations I showed you where we're planting in them, we're trying to remediate a problem someone else created. I personally do not ever desire to put a tree in those raised concrete containers or stack bricks around them. I've got the bricks under my maple tree. All of our landscapes are lined with brick edging in our yard, and we moved it severely out from the tree compared to where it was. I don't really like having those rocks sitting right on the roots of my tree up close to it, and I don't like the temptation to fill those raised edges in with mulch repeatedly. That's usually what you see happen. Maybe the first person who put that raised edging in knew what they were doing and was paying attention to their mulch, but over time you just see it just turns into a container for mulch that builds up against the trunk of the tree.
Sarah, I wanted to point out that Bob listed a bunch of woodland natives, some that bloom in spring. So everyone that's at the close to the bottom of the chat, he has a nice list there. Since we don't actually have a handout, maybe that's something that we need to create. Maybe we have one and it's just not on our website, but
we can fix that.
I didn't find it. Yeah.
Michelle, when you get the recordings of this, do you get the transcripts of the chat?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, because we might pull. There's a lot of Bob has shared multiple lists of plants in here.
Yeah.
And I copied and pasted a couple of them just now, just in case we can't get through the chat. But that would be something we can share out when we share the recording.
A couple other perennials that I see on that walk that cuts through to the greenhouses, where you showed the picture of that little woodland setting. There's Virginia bluebells that bloom there. Is that what those are called? Yeah. And also some kind of poppy, like Celadon poppy. It's yellow, and I don't remember the exact name of it.
Michelle, see, you're a plant expert. Yes, Celandine poppy and
okay,
Virginia
I was
bluebells.
pronouncing it wrong, but okay, good.
Yeah, those are two excellent ones. I'm glad you remembered those, because I was like going, okay, off the top of my head. Yeah, two excellent choices. Also, of course, you've got what is it? Bleeding Hearts, right? I mean, everybody was specifically asking for natives, but we're not native purists. We say there's room for both.
For sure. Okay. That went by fast, and those were some great questions. So thank you. We do have on our I see Sarah's note about Midwest ground covers. I guess is that the name of a business? Okay.
Yeah, so I added to a list of multiple places to purchase sedges.
Okay.
That really only applies if you're looking, but if usually when we're looking to use sedges, we're looking for quantities to create a ground cover.
We have on our resources webpage a list of good ground covers or living mulch. So you can also check out that handout under our resources section on plantnebraska.org. There's some good suggestions there. So we are going to wrap up, and thank you all for attending. Next week is our last plant talk. It's March 13th, I believe, Thursday at 12 noon. So we'll be talking about, as I mentioned, willows, cherry trees, and there was one other, and I'm drawing a blank. They're keystone species. So that should be a good one. Oaks. Oh, yeah. The most important keystone species. Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.